So last session we discussed about containers. Okay, let me just recap what we have discussed. Hold all backups. Okay, there's no backup. Not here. Okay, somewhere I shifted. It's okay. Let me. I hope they are. They must be in the portal, right? So, do you guys have portal link? Boot September. Do you all have access to this? I should have copied them here. Okay. So here the demo videos you have, and this is our regular session. Let me see if I can find our drawing. We talked about containers, right? In last discussion. No drawing. Okay. Yeah. You can see this picture and imagine, right? So in Spring application, thank you. Yeah. So in Spring application, we need a container to run all our classes, whichever it is, controller or service or DAO. We configure them in XML file and we load it into container. Spring containers are like your other containers like servlet container, EJB container, how they perform object creation and lifecycle management, right? Same way, Spring also will handle that. So before containers, we discussed about MVC architecture. We understand as per MVC, logically we separate front end and backend layers. Based on each responsibility, we maintain a view and backend code. We will have again three separate layers: controller, service, DAO. So we call these two as a model layer, the service and DAO are part of model. So instead of clubbing together everything, we need to maintain separate layers. For view, we should have a separate front end. Either you go with HTML or any JavaScript framework, right? Like Angular or React or any mobile UI. You need to maintain separate presentations and the backend code. Here for controller, earlier we used to use servlets, and for his service and DAO, we can use simple Java, and for DAO you can use JDBC combination, or else we may go with the servlets with the advanced concepts like EJB session beans and EJB entity beans combination here. Or you may go with combination of servlet framework like Struts, Spring MVC, or JSF. Any combination you can use with EJBs. Okay. With this combination also you can implement application. This is how enterprise applications we used to build before, you know, web services. And when people think only EJBs need to use for enterprise applications, only EJBs we used to use for business and service. So EJB entity beans are like your Hibernate ORM framework. Session beans are distributed components. Session beans are distributed components. I don't want to go much into it, but as a comparison, I want to show you here backend how we can implement with the servlets and the JDBC combination. You can implement, or servlet based frameworks also you can use. Servlet based frameworks you can use like Spring JSF, and again backend you can continue with EJBs, or you can use pure Spring itself. Though if it is not having all the capabilities of EJB, still EJBs are not mandatory for every application which is not a distributed. So in such case, you can use simple Spring MVC here, and for the basic capabilities which EJB is having, transaction capabilities and all we have in Spring transactions, the beautiful Spring AOP framework given. Here you can use Spring Basic Transactions, AOP, and Spring Basic Core also you can use. Coming to JDBC, Spring with JDBC we have, and the Spring with ORM also we have. ORM integration you can do here. But obviously here you can use Spring Security if you want to apply security to your application. Spring Security you can use part of your controller. What else module left? IOC. So when I use this combination, Spring MVC with when I use this combination, no other framework is required. Spring itself is sufficient to implement complete backend MVC to ORM. You can use complete MVC Spring framework to handle your application classes, controllers, and model classes. When I choose servlets with EJB's combination, or when I go with the Spring MVC, wherever you go, the object creation responsibility, first thing in Java, when I implement a class, one class to talk with another class, we need an object. If you create a plain Java classes, you need to create objects. When you choose frameworks, frameworks will create objects for you. So when I choose a framework like Servlet, or when I choose framework like EJBs, who handles object creation, Servlet objects or this controller objects will be managed by Tomcat. Either you choose servlets or struts, Spring MVC or JSF. Frameworks also will have a servlet. So all these objects are managed. So if I write a controller, remember that your controller object is created by Tomcat. There will be one single servlet even inside your frameworks also. While you are writing servlet, you can write any number of servlets for your application. But if you choose struts or Spring or JSF, they will come up with one front controller. That object also will be managed by Tomcat only. So your Tomcat is mandatory at least to create that framework object. One framework servlet will be there. So to create your framework servlet, you need Tomcat when you choose frameworks. If it is a pure servlet, of course, all your servlet objects will be managed by Tomcat. Tomcat is a container. You can call it as a servlet container. Who creates and manages objects? We can call them like containers. Servlet container. Who is servlet container? Tomcat. And to manage EJB objects, we need for this EJB objects we need EJB container, which is useful for implementing service and DAO. Okay, here you need EJB container. Application servers will come up with this EJB container. WebLogic, JBoss, WebSphere. There are many application servers. They are having EJB containers, including servlet container also. Application servers are having servlet and EJB container both, whereas servlet container come up with only servlet container. It can't handle EJBs. So you need a special container setup. You need to download them as I shown you, right? You have to download that softwares, special EJB software or Tomcat. You have to download in your local somewhere I created. It's okay. So you need to download that special set of software here, okay, to handle these classes. Not only writing code is sufficient. You need to write your code that should be compatible to your container. You should write this code and you need to configure it into an XML and you need to load it into your container. In 3 steps, you need to do that. Write code, configure it in XML file and load it into container. You need to write servlets. Servlets need to configure into web.xml file and you need to load your application into Tomcat. Same with EJBs. You need to write EJB classes. You need to configure EJBs into EJB XML file and you need to create EJB enterprise archive file and you need to load it into WebLogic. If it is a servlet, you need to create servlet classes. You should configure it into WebXML file. You need to convert it as a WAR file and you should deploy it. WAR. Here we use ER enterprise archive file we create and deploy. When it comes to Spring, when you choose Spring, at least for your framework servlet, you need Tomcat. Just a minute. So to run Spring classes also, you need a container. In Spring also you write classes, you need a container. So here we have that containers. We named them IOC containers. We named them IOC containers. These IOC containers are part of Spring library itself. We have these containers as part of your Spring core jar file and Spring context jar file. Am I correct? Spring core and context, or Spring beans and context. Hopefully, within these libraries, you can find Spring beans.jar. In this jar files itself, you can find these containers. So containers given in the form of jars distribution. They created jars. As part of that jars, all this framework capability is given. Spring team, right? Spring team, Spring developers who are working continuously for Spring framework development. Okay, so they will provide us these jar files. They will provide us these jar files. All frameworks, beautiful concepts they identified by adding all good design patterns. They created all these jar files. So you need not to have knowledge of all that patterns, but if you learn how to use Spring, that is sufficient. That internally follows all the best patterns for your application development. So learning is simple, though it is simple, you implement it internally, architecturally, it is very strong because all the best practices as they followed and implemented it. Okay, so that's where frameworks will help us a lot, right? So frameworks will come up with the powerful concepts. You just need to learn how to utilize that framework as part of your application so that all that framework capabilities will be applied to your application as well. Okay, so Spring is having so many great features that easily you can apply to your application. Is it complicated to learn? Means nothing. Simple. Just we need to know how to write these classes, each controller, service, DAO. That's it. Remaining everything will be taken care by Spring. So now coming to these containers, right? What they do when you implement controllers, service, DAO classes, right? Or any utility classes or validation classes or some date time utility classes or any logging classes, mail classes, whatever you implement. All your classes will be treated like beans for IOC. In IOC, every class will be treated like a bean class or a pozo class. Backend side, right? As a developer, as a backend developer, our focus will be on backend classes, controllers, services. Mostly we write these three classes always for every use case. Let's say you got a requirement like I need a front end page like name, email, registration page I want. I have three fields. When somebody give requirement like this with the submit button, as soon as I click on the submit button, name, email, address, data need to stored into database. In most of the cases, you will have the similar scenarios. You will be having some data in front end that you need to store it into backend, or else you have some data into backend table that you need to pull and show it into front end. Mostly you may save the data or later you may print that data into tables. Here I may need to show that users data. Mostly this is how you will have most of the scenarios. Either you need to save the data or you need to fetch and show the data. Send data or read data. Between your front end and database, you will be having Java classes, which are your controllers, service classes. and DAO classes. Mostly you will be writing these three classes. Apart from this, you may write some validation utilities or mail kind of utilities. Any additional code apart from your business if you have, you may keep it into utilities. And for entire application, maybe only one time you will be doing configurations. So that configuration classes you may have, right? Mostly you will be having controller service DAO for any use case. Use case classes. These are like configuration classes you may call. So mostly these three classes are sufficient for any use case. During your implementation, controller service DAOs for any use case. Either you want to send data from here to here, request you want to send this way, or you want to read it from database. So here simple POSO classes are sufficient for IOC. For your controller, service, DAO, simple bean classes are sufficient. Simple POSOs are sufficient for controller, for service, for DAO, for utils or configurations. Simple POSO is sufficient. It need not to be a complex class which is extending from frameworks. Like in Servlet, we extend or implement our class from generic Servlet or HTTP Servlet. If you remember struts, there we extend our classes from action classes or action forms. In JSF also we do the same. But Spring will not force us here. In EJBs also we do the same. We extend EJB session beans or entity beans and we implement our classes. Whereas Spring Framework is not mentioning that. Spring Framework is not mentioning that or not saying that implement my classes from my framework. It never says that. So implement a simple POSO class, simple bean class for your service, for your controller, for your DAO, or for utilities, or for configuration. Simple POSOs. The plain Java class. POSO stands for plain Java class. A plain Java class, which may have variables or it may not have. You may have literals here, variables. Whatever set of variables you can have here. Any type of variables you can have here, like integers or strings or any other object as a global variable dependency for your methods you can have here. Any variables, and you can have any number of methods, constructors here. So you can use pure Java concepts to implement your application. You can use pure Java concepts to implement your application. Okay. So disposer can be your controller, it can be your service, it can be your DAO or a util class or a configuration class. So these classes may be, you can treat these classes like a controller class or a service class or a DAO class or utility class, any class of your MVC. So just you need to configure this class into a XML file. In advanced concepts, we need not to use any XML concept, but we are starting with plain old framework, right? So here we see how we configure all these classes into a XML file, Spring XML file. Anything, anything we written as a POSO class, we configure that POSO class here as a bean. Using bean tag, we configure that class here. Any POSO. And finally, we load it into container. Finally, we load this into our IOC container. Finally, we load this into IOC container, which is your bean factory or application context or web application context. So we have three flavors, three flavors of IOC containers we have: bean factory, application context, or web application context. We have three flavors. We call bean factory as a core container. We call bean factory as a core container. In real time, we never use this. And application context, sometimes we use this. We call it as J2EE container. And for all web applications, we will be using web application context. Even in Spring Framework or Spring Boot Framework, internally it uses this last one, web application context. For end-to-end MVC applications, we use this web application context. Okay, so we have these three flavors. Mostly in real time, we will be using these two containers: application context and web application context. For all web applications, we use this. If you have any standalone based applications, you can use application context also, J2EE container or web container. Just a minute. Am I audible? Okay. So in real time, we use these two containers, J2EE and web application context. Okay, bean factory is a core container. We never use that much. Okay. So how these containers will help us? As I was saying before, when you implement your classes using frameworks or by using servlets or EJBs, you need special container support. They are there to create your classes objects. Without object, we can't deal anything. When there is a request coming from front end, before the front end request I read here, this object need to be ready. This object should have created. So servlet containers will do that, or EJB containers will do that job. When it comes to Spring, the same job will be taken care by your IOC containers. You can call them like IOC containers. These containers will create objects. First thing what they do, they will create objects for any class, either controller, service or DAO. They will create object first. And how many objects they create? Usually, right, while using servlets or EJBs, I will be having one class here, one servlet class or one EJB class, EJB session beans or entity bean classes here. When there is a user request, not only one, let's say if you take the same use case, registration, here in this session I have 26 students. So when all 26 students hits this controller, so you will be having one controller class hitting by 26 students. For 26 students, it is not going to create 26 special objects here. It will create only one single object. That single object will be utilized for 26 users. In case of servlets, one servlet object only will be created. One object for entire application cycle. Though you come today and register, after 1 month or 1 year, after 5 years also you come, you will be having one single object only here. The same case with EJBs. Is it enough having one single object? So what I am saying here is IOC will create only one object. If you take only one use case, right, application may have 5 or 10 or 20, 30, 50, any number of use cases. For each use case, consider you have one view and one controller service DAO. Views will be handled by your browser. You need not to worry about this view. Coming to backend classes, controllers or service or DAOs or your utility classes, whatever classes you have. Whenever you run your backend application, all these classes will be loaded into your RAM memory. If you have server with limited memory, you should use that memory or RAM wisely. You should not consume lot of RAM memory. If you consume it, your application performance may go down, or sometimes you may see no response from your application. So to use that RAM memory wisely, what you need to do here, instead of maintaining a new object for each user request which is coming from front end, let's keep one single object that is sufficient for any number of users. There is no challenge. If you use one single object, that itself is sufficient. Why? Because in any web application, while the request is coming to your backend, it will come in a separate thread. Separate thread will be created for each user request. So let's say Naveen requested, for him one separate thread will be created, and Akash requested, for him one separate thread. Pawan requested, for him one separate thread. Right? So for each of you, it will create a separate thread while the request is coming. So for each of us, so as we have 26 people here, if 26 people try to register, for each of us one separate thread will be created. Who take care of that? Tomcat. For any web application, you can imagine same story. When you submit the request, one thread will be created for you. So thread is always safe, right? One thread may not override other thread values, and there is no connection also between us. So I may open this form in my browser and I submit data. So my data is safe here in my thread. And when Akash access, so his data will be here. When Deekshit access, his data is here. When Pawan access, his data is in separate thread. So for each of us, as Tomcat maintains a separate thread, you need not to worry about multiple objects in backend memory. So here, as you have separate threads, controller class can be singleton. One object is sufficient. Here, one object is sufficient. One object is sufficient. One controller object is sufficient for Naveen, Deekshit, Pawan, Akash, and all of us. One service object is sufficient. One object, service class. One object for DAO. One object for utility. One object only for config. Single object is sufficient for all of our backend classes. What will happen if you have only one single object in the backend? Let's say your application is having 10 use cases, 10 forms. In other words, I have 10 forms here or 10 views. For each view, I have one separate controller, service, DAO, utility, and configuration class. So 10 into 5 classes, 50. 10 into 5, 50 classes I have in the backend. And here users count, I am expecting users count for 1 year, like 15 to 20 lakhs users may hit my application, or maybe per a month. Per month, this many users requests are coming to my application. Per month, 20 lakhs requests are coming to my application. And backend side I have 5 classes for each use case. 5 into 50 classes. Sorry, 10. 5 into 10 forms. So overall 50 classes I have here. 50 classes I have in the backend, including controller, service, DAO, and utility. So for 20 lakhs customers, if you imagine, it is not creating one object. If it is creating for each user a separate object, if it is creating, instead of creating only one single object, if it is creating prototype, means for each request one object if it is creating. Each request, if it is creating new object, instead of maintaining one object, for each request, if one new object is creating, for 20 lakhs, it will create 20 lakhs into 50. Imagine 20 lakhs into 50, it's around one, how many? 5 into 2, 10. 10 crores. Around 10 crores objects it need to create on your RAM. 50 classes into 20 lakh users. So end of the day, how many objects might have created on your RAM? 10 CR. 10 crore objects are really not required. If you make them prototype, it will create 10 crores objects on your RAM. And imagine about your RAM memory. For my application, which I am imagining 10 forms only, as architect, if you ask me to suggest, I will suggest you to keep 8 GB RAM is sufficient. I will say 8 GB RAM is sufficient for you. 8 GB RAM must be sufficient in your production memory, and a little bit hard disk as per your need. If you want to store images and lot of code and all, I may suggest you to keep 20 GB of hard disk, SSD, something like that. I may suggest. If you imagine 10 crores objects are creating in this 8 GB RAM, each object depends on the size, right? Let's say even if it is taking 5 KB or 10 kilobytes or 5 KB each class, if it is consuming 5 KB, 5 KB into 10 CR. I don't know the calculation, but you see how many KBs it will. 5 into 10, 50 KB, 50 CR KB. So 50 CR KB kilobytes to KBs to GB. How many? 50 CR. So 50 CR kilobytes meaning 500 gigabytes. 500 GB. Sorry, yeah, 500 GB is required. But what is the memory that I have in this my RAM? Kali 8 GB. So is it possible to at least to maintain that much 500 GB of memory in a single machine? I don't think. I don't think. Hardly we may maintain. I see in servers, right? Hardly we will be having 16 GB or 32 GB RAMs. How that small memories are sufficient? If your objects are going to take this much of memory, how this small memory is able to handle it? So if you choose prototype objects, really even supercomputers also not able to help you. If you implement your backend application with the prototype objects, your your backend implementations, if you use prototype objects, even supercomputers also can't help you, right? Because we will be having very small infrastructure for production. You need to use that memory wisely for your application. Okay, so instead of creating prototype objects, that's the reason, right? Instead of using prototype objects, your frameworks, either servlets or EJBs, they will use singleton objects only. One object only they will create for entire application, and your data also safe. Whichever data coming from front end or whichever data you are returning to the front end, that data will transfer via a separate thread only. So your singleton objects are safe. You need not to worry about your singleton objects. All your objects are application objects. You need not to worry. The data coming, right, the user data coming from front end to back end will come via threads. Separate thread will be maintained for user data. So you need not to worry about user data. Directly that user data will given to your methods. So methods will transfer from one class to another class. So you need not to worry about your data also. So here IOC containers or your servlet containers or EJB containers, they create only one object. End of the day, for your class, they will create only one object. That is the recommended pattern. In case if you want to create prototype, they don't stop you. You can create prototype, but it is going to eat your memory. That may not suitable for your production. Okay. So here IOC container, either bean factory or application context or web application context, when you load Spring XML file, right, it will create only one object for your poser class. Let's keep that application. You deploy it today. You implemented your application, okay, student management system or whatever, some food delivery application, or you have a shop. For that shop, you implemented one application to take online orders. So you deployed that today into your server. You purchased one server somewhere in GoDaddy and there you deployed it. Until next 1 year or 2 years, you did not disturb your application. Okay, you created application with 50 classes. Consider you created your application with 50 classes and you deployed it. During deployment time, this IOC containers will create that 50 objects. That's it. Next 1 year or 2 years, until you restart your application, 50 objects only will stay into your RAM. So wisely it will use your memory. So while purchasing your production server, you may take basic plan, 8 GB RAM or 4 GB RAM or 2 GB RAM. Production server is sufficient. They will charge hardly 500 or 600 rupees. So small business, small investment. Bus. So who makes you that much comfortable to deploy your application in very less memory? Frameworks will help you. Without framework, if you have created your application using simple Java classes, and if you have used a new keyword, and if you created objects unnecessarily without following any patterns or practices, that small memory may not sufficient. Always you will see complaints from your customers that your application is not working. When I choose the framework, you need not to worry. Framework will be taken care. Though you call 100 times, 200 times, thousands times, millions times, it will not create new object. It will create only one object. So as a first lesson, we will see how many objects IOC container will create. Already we saw an example, but let's see more in depth into it. Sorry. Do you guys have any doubts? So this is our workspace. So I'm using Eclipse. Okay, download Eclipse software first. You need softwares Java, Eclipse, and one database, MySQL or Oracle. Okay, always keep it ready. Okay, I'm creating application now. Just imagine project, simple Java project creating Kirana shop management system. Okay, so I may say e-store. I'm creating one application. Finish. I'm not going to add front end here. That will we will see later while discussing MVC. But try to imagine always, right? Whichever class is writing here, just try to assume that they are your controller service and DO classes. Don't simply assume that that is a simple bean class. Assume that that is a controller or service or DO class. or let me create packages in similar pattern. Com dot argue dot e-store dot web. I'll be writing one bean class, controller bean. Okay, order controller, a simple bean class, a simple bean class. System dot out dot println, order controller object created. Okay, as soon as somebody create objects, they call, while creating object they will call constructor definitely. If this class object creating means, they are calling this constructor. So I am saying we are not creating any object directly, IOC will create. If you are creating object, you will be following new keyword pattern. Okay, so let me see man created objects. If developer create objects, let's have test package. Developer main class. Without IOC container, if developer is doing object creation, what will happen if you consider for each user request, Naveen is ordering, Naveen want to order milk. So for me, he will create one separate object like this. I mean, in his code, dynamically it will create new objects. Order. And Dikshit wants to order something else. Order a pen. So for Dikshit also, one new object developer will create if you don't follow any frameworks. Okay, just assume. And Akash wants to order some book. For him also, developer will create one new object. So altogether when you run, it is created three objects. Order controller object, order controller object, order controller object. Like this, 5 million users or 2 million users if they request your application, 20 lakhs users if they request. 20 lakhs objects it will create literally. 20 lakhs objects it will create in your RAM. Maybe your RAM is not sufficient to, let's say, Amazon kind of applications during Great India sale, or they used to offer put the sales, right? Flipkart, millions of users request, for each seconds. If they would have created prototype objects in the backend, their servers definitely will be crashed. But they maintain singleton objects only. They don't put prototype objects in the backend. Millions of users request for every second during the sale, but server will not crash because they don't create multiple objects. As here in the session itself, we have 20 people. For 20 people, if I create 20 separate objects, it will consume, for same object, it will consume 20 times memory. Instead of this, if I go with the container will create one object only. Same scenario, let's see, configure this class into container, load it into container via Spring XML file. Create a Spring XML file here, resources. If you want to use Spring, just you need to go to build path, add the jar files which I mentioned. Add external jars, Spring. If you go with Maven, via Maven also you can add the dependencies. Spring Beans jar file, Spring Context, and a Spring Core jar file. I'm adding everything here, but 3 jar files are sufficient. Now create one Spring XML file here. XML, you need to follow some strictly one file format, okay? Put any name, but especially some tags given, only that tags only you should use here. So if I put tag name Navin, will it allow? Yeah, it will allow, but during loading it will say from where this tag came. How it will know that this tag is allowed or not? Via DTD or schema. XSD, it will recognize that. Whether these tags are there or not, who will tell? This DTD or XSD will tell. So that's why DTD or XSD must you should put here first. Okay. So DTD or XSD will validate your tags. So go to Spring Beans jar file. Where it is, Spring Beans. Here you have DTDs and XSDs. Let me open Spring Beans DTD. Spring Beans DTD file. You see all the DTD, doc type definition. DTD stands for document to type definitions. So what you can have in your document, that all definitions given here. So they given elements. The main elements is bean tag. Under the bean tag, what all attributes you can have. These all are the attributes. Inside bean tag, what all child tags we have. That child tags also given. If you go to bottom, yeah. So they given child tags as part of your bean tag you can have. Again for bean tag, what are all child tags or attributes you can have, everything given here. So if you have any doubt about your tag, whether the tag is there or not, open this DTD file and you can verify. Okay, but you need not to remember them. You will be learning them with the daily based practice. Okay, so you copy DTD here first from line number 36 to 37. Spring 2.0 DTD I'm using. But in advanced concepts, you never see XML, okay? Especially in Spring Boot. Without XML, we handle it. So now coming to main root tag, which is beans. So let's have bean tag here. And between beans and beans, you need to configure your order controller using bean tag. So mention one ID for it, maybe order controller, class, put fully qualified path, including your package, com.argue.restore.web dot controller, order controller. That's it. Order controller is configured. ID something order controller or order. So now instead of creating a direct object in your e-store, right? Developer, instead of following this approach, if you would have follow IOC main, via IOC if you have created that object. Okay, I don't want to follow this approach. I will use IOC. Use bean factory, which is very poor container. We never use this much. But let me give one example here. Bean factory equal to new XML bean factory. So here you need to load your resource, new class path resource. You need to input your XML file here, resources slash spring dot XML. That's it. This is how you need to load your XML first. What next? When Naveen need a object, order controller object, now you need not to use this new keyword. New keyword is a bad approach. Use factory dot get bean. Pass here your class name, order class, or you may give ID. Okay, I'll use the second approach only, order controller class. Whenever you need object, ask container. Container, I need that object. Okay, container will provide you the object. Same thing, I'm getting objects. Naveen need milk, so he want to place one order. So order object required. Dikshit need pen, he need one object. Akash need book, he need one object. Ask via container. You don't create object. See the difference. When I was created object using new keyword, three new objects it was created. But now three times I'm calling here my factory, but it created one object only. See, your constructor statement executed one time only. Constructor statement executed one time. What is the difference? When you use a new keyword, definitely it will call your constructor. I called three times new keyword, so three times it is calling your constructor. Let's imagine for int I equal to 0, I less than something 50, I plus plus. If I put the same statement, let's think 50 more users coming in. For them, I want to create objects. When I use new keyword, see this many objects got created. First to 3 plus, then next 50. 53 objects created. If this count increases to 5 lakh or 50 lakh, I don't know the count. 50 lakhs objects. I don't know when it will end. See, it is loading into my RAM. If I see the memory, right, lot of memory occupying. If you go and observe, right, if you open something like simple taskbar, also task manager, excuse me, Eclipse. See, like Eclipse is eating lot of memory here. Garbage collection also will happen, but we don't know when that object is released from. See, it created, but it took a lot of time to do that. 50 lakhs objects created. 50 lakhs. But the same stuff, if you want to create, if you have a need, you need not to create. So ask IOC container, it never create a new object for you. Same object, it will be served for you. So though you call it, see, execution also completed. Terminal also immediately finished within hardly 1 2 seconds. And only one object is created. How much, you know, memory got free. So it is not consuming CPU. Earlier it was used 50% of CPU, now 0%. So Java not eating lot of memory now. One single object only creating. So how it is creating one single object means whatever beans you have configured, always that beans are singletons. In case if you have any real requirement to make them prototype, you can mention it with the prototype. Mostly we never use prototype. At least I experienced, I never used prototype. When you configure prototype, same story. For every request, it will create new object. IOC container also will create new object. Taking time, right? So again, it will try to consume lot of memory here. Okay, anyway, we shut down it. So it will eat lot of memory and processing. So always it is recommended to use singleton. By default, your application beans scope is singleton. Default scope is singleton. Singleton scope is sufficient. Okay. So tomorrow we see the next type, container application context. Okay, and we will jump into next concepts, what we can have inside pozos, right? A simple pozo is sufficient, as I was saying. So what special needs your pozos may have when it is a controller or a service or DAO, we will understand that needs, and we will see how IOC can help. Okay,